cold that January night in 1889 was the kind that didn't just bite, it swallowed you whole, pulled you down into it like dark water closing over your head. Nora Calloway pressed her youngest daughter against her chest and felt the child's small body shaking in a way that had nothing to do with fear. 8-year-old Iris had stopped crying 2 hours ago, and that frightened Nora far more than any amount of weeping would have. Crying meant fighting. Silence meant surrender. On her right, 12-year-old Daniel sat hunched against the frozen bark of a spruce tree, his thin jacket soaked through, his lips the color of a bruise. He hadn't complained once since they'd left the road. He just kept watching the tree line with his father's eyes, serious, measuring, older than they had any right to be. They had been walking since noon. The wagon was still back on the Caribou Road, axles snapped clean through, tilted into the ditch like a broken promise. Everything they owned was in that wagon, a cast-iron pot, 2 wool blankets, Arthur's old surveying tools, and the small cedar box where Nora kept the papers. The papers that proved the land was theirs. The land that Aldous Byrne, land agent and de facto king of the Chilcotin Plateau, had spent the better part of 6 months trying to take from them. Nora had thought she was being careful. She had thought taking the back road through the timber country would buy them time before Vern's men caught up with the transfer documents she was trying to deliver to the land registry office in Clinton. She had been wrong about the axle. She had been wrong about a great many things since her husband Thomas had died. The mountains of the British Columbia interior did not care about wrongness. They did not care about widows or children, or the specific brand of quiet desperation that comes from watching your options close off one by one, like doors in a burning house. The mountains simply sat there, indifferent and enormous, while the temperature dropped and the sky turned the flat gray of a frozen lake. "Mama." Daniel's voice was careful, controlled. "There's a light." Nora looked up. Through the close-packed spruce, maybe a quarter-mile up the ridge, a faint orange glow pulsed against the dark, not the wavering blue of a lantern, something warmer, something alive. She had almost convinced herself it was her eyes playing tricks when she heard it. A low, rhythmic sound cutting beneath the wind. Axe on wood. Steady and unhurried, like a man with no reason to rush. Like a man who belonged completely to the cold and the dark and the trees. Then the sound stopped. The silence stretched long enough that Nora's heart had time to climb into her throat. Then, at the edge of the tree line, a shape appeared. It was massive, shoulders wide enough to block the gap between 2 spruce trunks, wrapped in a heavy canvas coat matted with wood chips and bark. He was carrying an axe in one hand and the lantern in the other, and he moved through the knee-deep snow the way a draft horse moves through mud. Like the resistance simply didn't apply to him. He stopped about 20 feet away, raised the lantern. In its light, his face was the color and texture of old saddle leather. He had a beard grown past any point of vanity, iron gray threaded through dark brown, and eyes, pale green or gray, she couldn't tell, that swept from Nora to Daniel to the small, too-still shape of Iris in a single quick motion. The kind of look that was doing arithmetic, not judgment. "Your girl," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel shifting at the bottom of a river. "She's sick. Or just cold." Nora pulled Iris tighter. "Cold. She'll be fine." The man said nothing for a moment. He looked at Iris's face, at the shallow, papery rise and fall of the child's chest, at the bluish tinge to her lips that Nora had been refusing to name for the past hour. "She won't be fine," he said, without any particular cruelty. "Not out here." Nora opened her mouth to argue. She had been arguing with men for the better part of a year. She had argued with the sheriff's deputy who showed up at her door with Vern's forged ledger. She had argued with the circuit judge who refused to hear her without legal representation she couldn't afford. She had gotten very good at it. But when she looked into those pale eyes, she found she had nothing left to throw at him. "My cabin's up the ridge," the man said. He set the lantern in the snow and held out one arm toward Iris slowly, the way you'd offer your hand to a spooked animal. "Give her to me. I can get there faster carrying her." "I don't know you," Nora said. "No," he agreed. "You don't." He waited. Nora looked at her daughter. She looked at the darkness pressing in from all sides, and the snow still falling, and the light a quarter-mile up the ridge. That meant shelter and warmth, and a morning her children might actually see. She placed Iris in his arms. He tucked the child inside his coat without hesitation, a motion so practiced and sure that for a disoriented moment Nora wondered if he'd done it before. He picked the lantern back up and turned toward the ridge. Stay close, the trail's iced over. His name was Callum Greer. She learned that later. The cabin was built into the granite face of the ridge like something the mountain had grown, rather than something a man had made. Massive squared logs chinked with moss and clay. A low roof weighted with 2 feet of snow. A stone chimney exhaling steady gray smoke into the black sky. Inside, a wood stove large enough to heat a church threw heat so intense that Nora's face ached when they stepped through the door. Callum set Iris down on a bearskin near the stove before he'd even fully closed the door behind them. He pulled blankets from a cedar chest. Thick Hudson's Bay wool, red and green stripes, and began wrapping the child with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had kept things alive in the cold before. Nora stood in the center of the room and tried to make sense of it. A cabin this tight and well-built, stocked like a man expected a siege, shelves of dried goods and hanging herbs and braided sweetgrass, tools organized on wooden pegs with a care that suggested a precise mind. No clutter, no waste. And on the far wall, mounted in a simple pine frame, a provincial surveyor's map of the Chilcotin and Thompson River country, covered in pencil notations in 2 different hands. One of those hands, she realized slowly, she recognized. "Where did you get that map?" she said. Callum had been filling a pot with water from a barrel near the stove. He stopped. "The surveying notes," Nora said, her voice dropping to something almost accusatory. "In the upper corner. That's Thomas's handwriting." Callum put the pot on the stove. He turned around to look at her, and something had shifted in his expression, a tension around his eyes that hadn't been there a moment ago. "Your husband was Thomas Calloway." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Nora said. Her pulse was doing something irregular. "He died 14 months ago. They told me it was an accident on the survey line." She searched Callum's face. "How do you have his notes?" Callum crossed to the map and stood before it for a long moment. Then he reached up and took it down from the wall. He handed it to her. "He left it with me," Callum said carefully. "About 3 weeks before he died. He came through in a bad storm. I kept him 2 nights, same as you." A pause. "He told me if anything happened to him and a woman named Nora came looking, I should give it to her." The world went very quiet. "He knew," Nora whispered. "He suspected," Callum said. "There's a difference. He suspected Aldous Verne had figured out what his survey found. He needed the note somewhere safe that Verne wouldn't think to look." The pale eyes held steady on hers. "The survey isn't just a property boundary map, Mrs. Calloway. Thomas found a coal seam on the eastern quarter of your land, significant enough that the CPR had already been sniffing around before Verne moved on your title." Nora sat down on the nearest bench. She didn't choose to. Her legs simply made the decision for her. Daniel had been standing by the door through all of this, a 12-year-old trying to look like he wasn't absorbing every word. He was absorbing every word. He crossed the room and sat down beside his mother without being asked. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand over hers on the map, which was the most Thomas thing Nora had seen in over a year, and she had to look away before she came undone entirely. Iris woke up around midnight, flushed and coughing but asking for water in a way that meant she was present, which was enough. Callum brewed something with dried herbs from a tin on the shelf. Labrador tea and something else she didn't recognize, sharply medicinal, and sat cross-legged on the floor beside the child while she drank it, answering her feverish questions about the bearskin and the wood stove, and whether he'd shot the bear himself with the patient, minimal manner of a man who was used to silence and found talking less objectionable than she'd expected. Nora watched him and thought Thomas trusted this man. Thomas, who had trusted almost nobody. She didn't sleep. She sat at the heavy pine table with the survey map spread between her hands and read her dead husband's notations in the lamplight. The careful measurements and geological markings that Aldous Verne had killed him over. That Verne was willing to have her and her children killed over. The numbers were extraordinary. She didn't know much about coal, but she knew the CPR had been building westward for a decade, and she knew what companies paid for, guaranteed fuel supply, on a mountain rail line. And when she multiplied what she knew, the figure she arrived at made her hands shake. Thomas had been protecting them, Even from the grave, he had been building a wall around them. She looked up and found Callum watching her from across the room. He was sitting in a ladder-back chair near the stove with a mug of something, elbows on his knees, and there was a quality to his stillness that she was starting to understand wasn't emptiness. It was the opposite. It was a man who had gotten very good at keeping things inside. "Why are you out here alone?" she asked. "A man who builds a cabin like this, who knows the country the way you do. You could work anywhere." He looked at the fire for a moment. "I did," he said. "I was a Dominion surveyor. 10 years. Good work, mostly." He paused. 4 years ago, I filed a report on a survey in the Okanagan. Flagged some irregularities in the land transfer. The kind that pointed back to a particular land agent who had friends in Victoria. His jaw shifted. The report was suppressed. I was dismissed. The land agent kept his position and expanded into the Chilcotin. He looked at Nora steadily. His name was Gerald Verne, Aldous' father. The hair on her arms stood up. "You were driven out by the same family," she said. "The son is more careful than the father," Callum said. "Covers his tracks better. But the pattern is the same. Find the value in land before the owner knows it's there. Move on the title before they can protect it." A long silence settled over the room. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pushing hard against the logs. Inside, the stove ticked, and the lamp breathed light across the survey map and across Thomas's handwriting. The last thing he had touched that still held the shape of his thinking. "I need to get to Clinton," Nora said. "The land registry. If I can file Thomas's survey as evidence of contested title before Verne completes the transfer, it stalls the whole process, buys time for a proper inquiry." "Verne has men watching the Clinton Road," Callum said. "I know that. There's a winter route over the plateau, harder going, but it comes out above the town, bypasses the main road entirely." He studied her face. "It's not a walk, Mrs. Calloway. 2 days in this cold with 2 children. "What's your alternative?" Nora said. "Stay here until spring while Verne finishes taking everything my husband worked for?" Callum was quiet for a moment. Then something moved across his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but something adjacent to it. A kind of recognition. "No," he said. "I suppose not." They left at first light. The plateau route was every bit as brutal as he'd implied, and then some. The snow was crusted at the surface and powdery beneath, so each step punched through the crust and into thigh-deep powder in a rhythm that was exhausting beyond description. Callum broke the trail with his own body, compressing a narrow path with each heavy stride. And Nora followed with Daniel close behind her and Iris strapped to Callum's back in a makeshift carrier fashioned from a canvas pack, and 2 lengths of rope, a solution he'd rigged in about 4 minutes that morning that Nora had stared at with something close to awe. Iris was better than the night before. Not well, but better. She dozed against Callum's broad back in the early morning cold, and when she woke she pointed at things. A raven in a snag, a line of fox tracks, a snow-draped spruce that she said looked like an old woman, and Callum answered each observation in his low, unhurried voice without breaking stride. Daniel walked beside Nora. He was carrying the canvas bag with the survey map sealed inside a waxed envelope, gripping it with both hands. "Do you trust him?" Daniel asked quietly, during a stretch when Callum was far enough ahead not to hear. "I trust that your father did," Nora said. Which was the honest answer. Which was, she had come to understand in the past 14 months, the only kind of answer worth giving. They were an hour below the plateau's edge when the sound reached them. Not wind, not wildlife. The muffled, purposeful crunch of horses moving through snow at a trot, coming from somewhere below and to the east. Callum stopped instantly. He turned his head, listening with the particular stillness of an animal that spent its life reading landscape for threats. Then he turned back and looked at Nora. "How many people know you took the back road?" he said, his voice very low. "Nobody," Nora said. Then, before the word was fully out, "The liveryman in Lochlaheche. He saw us leave." Callum nodded once. His face was completely calm in the way that Nora was beginning to recognize as its most alarming mode. He scanned the tree line above them, then pointed to a dense stand of subalpine fir 20 meters up the slope. "Take the children up there," he said, "into the trees, deep enough that you can't be seen from below. Keep Iris warm and keep her quiet." He reached into his coat and produced a short-barreled rifle that Nora hadn't known he was carrying. He checked the breech with the automatic motion of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "Do not come out until I come for you. Not for any sound you hear. Do you understand me?" "What are you going to do?" Nora said. "I'm going to find out who it is and whether they know where we are," he said. "And I'm going to give them a reason to wish they'd stayed on the main road." He said it without drama, without performance. Just a statement of fact, the way you'd describe a change in weather. Nora took Iris from the carrier and held out her hand for Daniel, and she stopped. She looked at Callum squarely. "Don't do anything that can't be undone," she said. Something passed through his pale eyes. "I stopped making that mistake a long time ago, Mrs. Calloway." He paused. "Go." They went. Tucked into the furs with Iris pressed against her and Daniel kneeling at her side, Nora could hear almost nothing, only the wind and the distant, indeterminate sounds that could have been horses or could have been her own heart. She discovered she was praying in the wordless, structureless way of someone who has stopped believing in the formal architecture of prayer, but still can't stop talking to something. It was 20 minutes. It felt like considerably longer. Then there were voices below, 2, maybe 3, and for a moment they were too indistinct to make out, and then one of them rose in something that was not quite a shout but close, and then went abruptly silent. And then nothing, for a long time. And then the sound of Callum's boots punching through the crust, climbing the slope toward them. He was entirely undamaged in any visible way. His expression was the same as it had been when he left them. He crouched in the snow to look at Iris's face, and then stood back up. "3 of Vern's men," he said. "They don't work for him anymore." Nora searched his face. "Are they?" "They're alive," he said, and the flatness of his voice left no room for follow-up questions. "They'll walk out when the feeling comes back to their hands. I have their horses." He looked at Daniel. "You'll be faster riding the rest of the way. Can you manage a horse in the snow?" Daniel straightened. "Yes, sir." They rode into Clinton in the late afternoon. The winter sun stretched thin and golden across the frozen rooftops. 3 people on 2 horses, which was not the entrance Nora had envisioned, and the survey map tucked in its waxed envelope inside her coat, pressed against the place where her heartbeat was finally starting to slow towards something resembling a normal pace. The Dominion Land Registry office was in a long-frame building on the main street beside the post office. A government clerk with ink-stained fingers and a magnificent mustache looked up from his ledger when they came in. He looked at Nora. He looked at Callum. He looked back at Nora. "I need to file a contested title claim," Nora said, placing the survey map on his counter. "And I need a telegraph sent to the CPR survey office in Kamloops. Tonight, if possible." The clerk's mustache moved in a way that suggested he was about to explain why these things could not be accomplished today. Callum stepped up to the counter beside Nora. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. There was simply a quality to his presence in that small room, something about the size of him and the particular steadiness of his regard, that seemed to reorganize the clerk's thinking at a fundamental level. "Of course," the clerk said, pulling a fresh form from a drawer. "Right away." The thing about Aldous Vern was that he was meticulous. He was patient. He had learned from his father's mistakes, and he had spent years cultivating relationships with local officials, and he had assumed that a widow with 2 children and no legal representation and no money and a dead husband's unregistered survey was essentially no obstacle at all. He had not, in his calculations, accounted for the CPR. When the railway company received Nora's telegraph, along with the copy of Thomas's survey notations indicating a coal seam on her land significant enough to supply fuel for the mountain sections of the transcontinental line, their response was swift in the way that large amounts of money tend to. Make things swift. Within 10 days, a CPR legal representative arrived in Clinton. Within 3 weeks, a Dominion Lands Commissioner had been dispatched from Ottawa. Within 6 weeks, Aldous Vern was defending himself before a federal inquiry into the systematic misappropriation of surveyed lands across the Caribou and Chilcotin districts. Cullen Boyd had been Vern's enforcer for 11 years. He'd done things he couldn't put names to, on behalf of a man he genuinely believed was too powerful to fall. He was the first to accept the commissioner's offer of reduced charges in exchange for a full account of operations. The second and third followed before the week was out. Vern was convicted in the spring and sentenced to 7 years in the Kamloops Penitentiary. It was, most people agreed, considerably less than he deserved. The coal rights were registered in Nora's name. She was 26 years old. The ranch she bought was on the Thompson River valley floor. 200 acres of floodplain meadow and good timber. The kind of land that made you understand, standing on it in the spring thaw with mud on your boots and the river running loud and cold over the stones. Why people had come west in the first place. Daniel took to it as though he'd been waiting for it his whole short life, learning the fencing and the water management and the seasonal rhythms with a thoroughness that made the neighboring ranchers nod and say Thomas Calloway's boy had his father's instincts. Iris got a dog. She named it Survey, which Nora thought was either a tribute or a commentary, possibly both. Callum appeared in the valley in early April, riding a roan horse and looking mildly uncertain. The first time Nora had ever seen that particular expression on his face. He stopped at the gate. He said he'd been offered a contract with the Dominion Survey Office again, reinstated on the strength of the inquiry evidence, and that Clinton was a reasonable base for the kind of field work they wanted from him, and that he'd been thinking about the valley. He said all of this to the gatepost rather than to Nora specifically. Nora told him to come in and have coffee. He did. He came back the week after that, and the week after that. By June he had fixed the fence along the river section that had been troubling her since the spring runoff, and by July Daniel was following him around with the unabashed admiration of a boy who has found something he'd quietly been looking for. Nora didn't say anything about it for a long time. Some things, she had learned, were better allowed to grow at the pace they were going to grow, rather than the pace you wished they would. One evening in late August, she was sitting on the steps of the porch, watching the light go gold on the river and listening to the sound of Callum reading aloud to the children inside through the open window, something with wolves in it, from the sound of Iris's periodic delighted gasps, and she thought about the frozen plateau and the man who had broken the trail through chest-deep snow while carrying her daughter on his back, and about Thomas's notes in the map margin, and about the particular kind of trust that didn't announce itself. She thought, the hardest winters have a way of showing you exactly who you're standing next to when the cold comes in. The door opened behind her, and Callum came and sat down on the step beside her, the distance between them less than it had been in April, less than it had been in the spring, less than it would be by the time the snow came again. They sat and watched the Thompson run gold and copper in the last of the August light, the valley quiet around them, the children's voices carrying warm through the open door behind them, and Nora, who had spent the better part of 2 years fighting with everything she had just to keep standing, felt the particular relief of someone who has finally, quietly, without announcement, made it home. What stays with me most about Nora's story isn't the moment she handed Iris to a stranger in the dark. It's the moment just before it, when she stood there in the snow, exhausted and terrified, and made herself think clearly anyway. That's the thing nobody talks about, how much it costs to keep your head when everything in you wants to fall apart. I've thought about what Thomas did with that survey map. He knew something was wrong. He knew men were watching him. And instead of panic, instead of rage, he quietly found the one person he trusted, and he made a plan. He hid the most valuable thing not in a strongbox, not in the ground, but inside the binding of a book that looked like nothing. That kind of thinking doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a man who spent his whole life paying attention, who understood that the truth, if you keep it careful, can outlast the people trying to bury it. Thomas didn't survive the winter, but his clarity did, and it saved his family. Callum is the part of the story I keep coming back to. He had every reason to stay inside his cabin and let the world do what it was going to do. He'd already been burned by it, literally driven out for doing the right thing, watching his career and his reputation get dismantled by the same family that came for Nora. Most people, after something like that, find a way to stop caring. It's just easier. But when he saw those children in the snow, he didn't calculate the risk or weigh the cost. He just moved. That's not something you can fake. Either it's in you or it isn't. And Nora. I think about the moment in the registry office when the clerk started to hedge and she just stood her ground and said what she needed clearly, without apology. She was 26 years old. She'd been on the road for 2 days in a blizzard. She was running on cold coffee and grief and whatever fuel a person finds when there's nothing left but necessity. And she still walked in there like she belonged. because she knew what she had. She understood the value of what Thomas had given her, and she wasn't going to leave until someone acknowledged it. That's the thread running through all three of them, I think. The willingness to be honest about what's real, about what the cold actually is, about who the enemy actually is, about what the evidence actually shows, and then to act on it anyway, even when acting is the harder thing. We talk a lot about resilience, like it's something you either have or you don't. But watching Nora drag her children through the Caribou in January, watching Callum build a cabin out of loss and keep showing up anyway, watching Daniel grip that map with both hands and keep walking, I don't think it works like that. I think it's a choice you make, over and over, in ordinary moments. You choose to tell the truth when lying is easier. You choose to think carefully when fear is screaming at you to just react. You choose to keep going when the reasonable thing would be to sit down in the snow. Most of the time, nobody sees those choices. They happen in the cold and the dark and the private interior of a person trying to figure out what they're made of. But they add up. Thomas's choices added up to a map inside a book that saved his children's lives after he was gone. That's not luck. That's a life lived with enough integrity that even the last desperate act of it pointed towards something good. What part of Nora's story stayed with you? I'd love to know in the comments.